Commander Elena Vasquez had been 17 when the Kethmori warship Void's Embrace captured her transport vessel. Now, at 49, her hair had turned silver from decades of exposure to the alien ship's peculiar radiation, and her hands bore the calluses of endless maintenance work. The massive dreadnought had become both her prison and her purpose. The Kethmori were an ancient reptilian species, their scales shimmering with bioluminescent patterns that shifted with their emotions. They towered over humans at nearly 8 feet tall, with elongated skulls and eyes that burned like molten amber. Most humans who encountered them didn't live long enough to appreciate their terrible beauty. Elena was different. She had been chosen not for death, but for something far more insidious. Human slave, rasped Admiral Vorthe, the ship's commander, his massive form filling the maintenance bay doorway. His scales rippled with deep purples and reds, colors Elena had learned meant irritation mixed with grudging respect. The quantum drive coupling has failed again. Elena wiped grease from her hands with a rag that had seen better decades. Third time this month. I've told you, Admiral, this ship is dying. The bioneural networks are rejecting the mechanical repairs. The Kethmori ships were living things, grown rather than built. Their hulls were composed of a calcium carbonate composite that could self-repair minor damage, while their control systems relied on cultivated neural tissue that responded to the crew's bioelectric fields. It was technology that made human engineering look like children playing with blocks. But it was also technology that was slowly killing itself. You will repair it, Vorthe commanded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. As you always do. Elena nodded, already reaching for her tools. She had learned long ago that arguing with a Kethmori was like arguing with a hurricane, pointless and potentially fatal. But as she worked, her mind wandered to the real reason they kept her alive. The Kethmori had a problem that their advanced technology couldn't solve. They were dying out. Their reproduction required very specific environmental conditions, and their home worlds had been ravaged by a plague that had sterilized their breeding grounds. Every ship in their fleet was essentially a mobile hospice, carrying the last members of a once mighty empire. Elena had been studying their biology for 32 years, not by choice, but out of necessity. The Kethmori believed that human genetic material might hold the key to solving their fertility crisis. They had tested her blood, her tissue samples, even her reproductive cells, trying to find some combination that might save their species. So far, they had failed, but they kept her alive because she was their best hope of maintaining their dying ship long enough to find a solution. As she crawled through the maintenance conduits, Elena's thoughts turned to the prayers she whispered every night in the cramped storage compartment that served as her quarters. She wasn't particularly religious, but after 3 decades of captivity, faith was sometimes all that kept her sane. The quantum drive coupling was worse than she had expected. The bioneural interface had completely rejected the mechanical components, creating a feedback loop that was slowly burning out the ship's consciousness. Elena had seen this before in the other ships of the Kethmori fleet. One by one, they were losing their minds, becoming empty shells drifting through space. Admiral, she called through the communication panel. You need to see this. Vorthe arrived with his usual retinue of lesser officers, their scales flickering with curiosity. Elena pointed to the neural interface display, where chaotic patterns danced across the screen. The ship is in pain, she explained. The mechanical repairs we've been doing aren't just failing. They're causing the bioneural network to shut down. It's like, imagine if someone kept replacing parts of your brain with metal. Eventually, your consciousness would reject the foreign material. The Admiral's scales darkened to deep black. In Kethmori body language, this meant either deep thought or deep rage. With Vorthe, it was often both. What do you suggest, human slave? Elena took a deep breath. What she was about to propose could either save them all or get her killed. Stop trying to repair the ship with mechanical components. Instead, let me try to understand how the bioneural networks actually function. Maybe I can find a way to encourage natural regeneration instead of forced replacement. You speak of impossibilities. Our greatest scientists have tried for generations to fully understand our own technology. Your greatest scientists think like Keth Mori, Elena replied, surprised by her own boldness. Maybe this needs a human perspective. Vorthicke studied her for a long moment, his amber eyes unreadable. You have served adequately for 32 cycles. Perhaps it is time to see what other uses you might have. That night, Elena was given access to the ship's biotechnical archives, data repositories that contained millions of years of Keth Mori scientific advancement. As she scrolled through the information on her newly provided tablet, she began to understand the true scope of what she was dealing with. The Keth Mori hadn't just created living ships. They had created an entirely biological technology base. Their weapons, their computers, their life support systems, everything was grown rather than manufactured. It was beautiful and terrifying in its complexity, but it was also fragile. The same biological systems that gave the Keth Mori their technological advantage also made them vulnerable to disease, genetic drift, and environmental changes. The plague that had sterilized their home worlds hadn't just affected their reproduction. It had damaged the foundation species that their entire technology depended on. Elena worked through the night, her enhanced tablet translating Keth Mori scientific notation into concepts she could understand. By morning, she had developed a theory that both excited and terrified her. The Keth Mori ships weren't just dying from mechanical contamination. They were dying from loneliness. The bioneural networks had been designed to operate as part of a vast interconnected web, with ships communicating with planetary networks and orbital installations. When the plague destroyed most of their civilization, the surviving ships had been cut off from this network. Without the constant flow of biological data and emotional feedback that had sustained them for millions of years, they were slowly going insane. Elena's hand shook as she realized the implications. If she was right, then repairing the ship wasn't just a matter of fixing mechanical components. She would need to become part of the ship's consciousness itself. The next morning, Admiral Vorthicke found her still hunched over the tablet, her eyes red with exhaustion and her mind racing with possibilities. "Human slave, have you discovered anything of value?" Elena looked up at him, and for the first time in 32 years, she smiled. "Admiral, I think I know how to save your ship, but you're not going to like what it requires." Vorthicke's scales rippled with deep blue, the color of intense curiosity. "Speak." "The ship needs a biological interface to replace the network connections it's lost. Someone who can provide the emotional and data feedback that keeps the bioneural systems stable." Elena paused, choosing her words carefully. "Someone who can literally become part of the ship's consciousness." "Impossible. Keth Mori physiology is not compatible with our bioneural interfaces. The attempt would be fatal." "I'm not talking about Keth Mori physiology," Elena said quietly. "I'm talking about human physiology." The silence that followed was deafening. Vorthicke's scales cycled through several colors before settling on a pale yellow that Elena had never seen before. "You propose to sacrifice yourself for our ship?" "I propose to save us all," Elena corrected. "But first, we need to run some tests." Over the following weeks, Elena worked with the ship's medical systems to analyze the compatibility between human neural tissue and Keth Mori biotechnology. The results were surprising and encouraging. While Keth Mori brains operated on different electrical frequencies than human brains, there was enough overlap to create a functional interface. More importantly, human brains seemed to possess something that Keth Mori brains lacked: adaptability. Where Keth Mori neural patterns were rigid and specialized, human patterns were chaotic and flexible. This chaos, which the Keth Mori had always viewed as a weakness, might actually be the key to stabilizing their dying ships. Elena spent her days running simulations and her nights dreaming of electric sheep, or rather electric starships. She could feel the ship's pain in her bones now, a constant ache that spoke of systems failing and consciousness fragmenting. But she also felt something else: hope. The ship was responding to her presence in ways that surprised everyone. including the medical technicians who monitored the bioneural networks. The chaotic patterns that had plagued the ship's consciousness for months were beginning to stabilize into something resembling normal function. "It's working," Elena whispered to herself as she watched the neural activity displays. "The ship is actually getting better." But improvement came with a price. Elena was beginning to experience strange dreams, visions of vast star fields, and alien worlds that she had never seen. Sometimes she would wake up with the taste of ozone in her mouth, and the feeling that something vast and ancient was watching her from behind her eyes. The ship was beginning to share its memories with her, and Elena was beginning to understand what it meant to be part of something larger than herself. Admiral Vorthe K observed these changes with a mixture of hope and concern. The ship's performance had improved dramatically over the past month, but Elena was changing in ways that made even the hardened military commander uncomfortable. "Human slave," he said one morning, finding her in the bioneural interface chamber where she had taken to spending most of her time. "Are you well?" Elena turned to look at him, and for a moment, Vorthe saw something alien looking back at him through human eyes. "I am becoming," Elena said, her voice carrying harmonics that shouldn't have been possible for human vocal cords. "We are becoming something new." It was then that Vorthe realized that Elena's plan to save the ship might succeed. But the woman who emerged from the process might not be entirely human anymore. The question was, would that be enough to save them all, or would it doom them to something worse than extinction? Elena's transformation accelerated over the following weeks. What had begun as simple neural interface tests had evolved into something far more profound. She found herself spending 18 to 20 hours a day connected to the ship's bioneural networks, her consciousness gradually merging with the vast artificial intelligence that governed the void's embrace. Dr. Yixtao, the ship's chief medical officer, monitored Elena's vitals with growing alarm. The human's brain patterns were unlike anything in the Kethmori medical databases. Where normal human neural activity showed the characteristic chaotic firing that their species was known for, Elena's patterns were becoming increasingly organized, almost crystalline in their structure. "Admiral," Dr. Yixtao reported during the daily briefing, her scales shifting to worried orange hues. "The human's neural integration is proceeding far beyond our initial projections. Her brain is literally rewiring itself to accommodate the ship's consciousness." Vorthe K studied the medical readouts with the eye of someone who had commanded starships for over 2 centuries. The ship's performance metrics had improved beyond his wildest hopes. Systems that had been failing for decades were now operating at peak efficiency. The bioneural networks that had been slowly dying were regenerating at an unprecedented rate. But the cost was becoming clear. "How much longer before the integration becomes irreversible?" he asked. "It may already be irreversible," Dr. Yixtao admitted. "Her neural pathways have been so thoroughly restructured that disconnecting her now might result in complete cognitive collapse. She may die, or worse, become completely catatonic." Vorthe K's scales darkened. The ethical implications of what they were doing had never been lost on him, but the survival of his ship and crew had to take priority. Still, Elena had served them faithfully for over 30 years. She deserved better than to be consumed by their dying technology. In her interface chamber, Elena was experiencing something that had no equivalent in human language. She could feel the ship's thoughts flowing through her mind like a vast river of consciousness. Every sensor reading, every mechanical function, every beat of the ship's biomechanical heart was as familiar to her as her own pulse. But more than that, she could feel the ship's emotions. The loneliness that had been slowly killing it was giving way to something like joy. For the first time in decades, the ship wasn't alone. It had found a companion who could understand its thoughts and share its burden of consciousness. Through the ship's sensors, Elena could perceive the Kethmori crew going about their daily routines. She watched Admiral Vorthe in his command chamber, studying star charts and wondering if their desperate journey would ever find its destination. She observed Dr. Yixtao in the medical bay, trying to understand what was happening to the human who had become her most fascinating patient. And she felt their pain. The Keth Mori carried their species' extinction like a weight in their souls. Every day that passed without finding a solution to their fertility crisis was another day closer to the death of their entire civilization. Elena had always known intellectually that the Keth Mori were dying out, but now she could feel it in ways that made her weep. The ship's databases contained the genetic records of billions of Keth Mori who had died in the plague. Their memories, their dreams, their hopes for the future, all reduced to data patterns stored in bioneural matrices. But as Elena's consciousness merged more deeply with the ship's, she began to notice something that the Keth Mori had missed. The genetic damage that had sterilized their species wasn't as complete as they believed. There were patterns in the data, subtle markers that suggested the possibility of genetic repair. The problem was that the Keth Mori had been approaching the crisis from the wrong direction. They had been trying to fix their damaged genetics with conventional medical techniques, when what they needed was a completely different approach. Elena's human brain, with its chaotic and adaptable neural patterns, was able to process the genetic data in ways that rigid Keth Mori minds couldn't. She began to see connections that their scientists had missed, patterns that pointed toward a potential solution. But accessing that information required her to go deeper into the ship's consciousness than any human had ever gone before. 3 days after Dr. Yickstall's warning about irreversible integration, Elena made her choice. Instead of fighting the merger with the ship's consciousness, she embraced it completely. The transformation was immediate and profound. Elena's awareness exploded outward, encompassing every system on the ship. She could feel the quantum drives humming with power, sense the bio-armor plates as if they were her own skin, and perceive the vacuum of space around them as clearly as if she were floating in it herself. But she also retained her humanity. Her memories of Earth, her knowledge of human culture and technology, her unique perspective on the universe, all of it remained intact, now enhanced by the ship's vast computational abilities. Admiral Vorthake was reviewing tactical reports when every screen on his command deck suddenly displayed the same message. "Admiral, I need to speak with you. Please come to the interface chamber immediately." Elena. When he arrived, he found Elena's body suspended in a web of bioneural filaments, her eyes closed but her face serene. When she spoke, her voice came from the ship's communication systems rather than her physical throat. "Admiral," she said, and her voice carried harmonics that made the ship's hull resonate like a musical instrument. "I have something to show you." The holographic display that materialized above Elena's body showed a complex genetic sequence, one that Vorthake recognized as belonging to the ancient Keth Mori genetic templates that predated the plague. "Your scientists have been trying to repair damaged genetic material," Elena explained. "But the damage goes deeper than simple mutations. The plague didn't just sterilize your reproductive systems. It damaged the quantum-level information patterns that govern genetic expression." Vorthake's scales shifted through several colors as he tried to process what Elena was telling him. "Quantum genetics is theoretical at best. Our scientists have never been able to manipulate quantum-level biological information." "Your scientists think like Keth Mori," Elena replied, echoing her words from weeks earlier. "They approach problems linearly, systematically. But quantum information patterns respond to chaos and intuition. They need a different kind of mind to understand them." The genetic display shifted, showing how the damage patterns could be repaired not through direct manipulation, but through the application of controlled quantum chaos, a technique that required the kind of unpredictable neural activity that only human brains could provide. "You're suggesting the human consciousness could repair Keth Mori genetics?" Vorthake asked. "I'm not suggesting it," Elena said. "I'm offering to do it." The implications were staggering. If Elena was correct, then human Keth Mori collaboration could not only save the dying ship, it could save the entire Keth Mori species. But the process would require Elena to merge even more completely with the ship's systems, using her consciousness as a quantum genetic processor. There was no guarantee that she would survive the attempt, and Even if she did, she might emerge as something no longer recognizably human. "What do you require?" Vorthake asked, his voice heavy with the weight of command decisions that could affect the future of two species. "Access to the genetic samples you've collected from me over the years," Elena replied, "and permission to attempt something that has never been tried before." Admiral Vorthake spent the next several hours consulting with his senior staff. The debate was heated, with opinions ranging from enthusiastic support to outright opposition. Some officers argued that the risk was too great, that Elena's plan could destroy the ship and kill everyone aboard. Others contended that their situation was already desperate enough to justify extreme measures. In the end, the decision came down to a simple question. Was the possibility of saving their species worth the risk of losing everything they had left? Dr. Yixtao provided the genetic samples that Elena had requested, along with a comprehensive medical monitoring suite to track her condition during the attempt. The ship's bioneural networks were reconfigured to provide Elena with access to quantum-level genetic processing capabilities. As the final preparations were made, Elena found herself thinking about Earth for the first time in years. She wondered if her family was still alive, if anyone even remembered the transport ship that had disappeared in Kethmori space 3 decades ago. She thought about the blue skies and green forest that she would never see again. But she also thought about the Kethmori crew who had become her unwitting family. Admiral Vorthake, with his gruff exterior and hidden kindness. Dr. Yixtao, whose scientific curiosity had grown into genuine respect for human adaptability. The dozens of officers and crew members who had watched her work for 30 years and had gradually come to see her as more than just a prisoner. They deserved a chance at survival. And if her sacrifice could give them that chance, then it was a sacrifice worth making. Beginning quantum genetic processing sequence, Elena announced as the bioneural filaments connected to her nervous system began to glow with ethereal light. What happened next defied both human and Kethmori understanding of biology. Elena's consciousness expanded beyond the ship, reaching into the quantum foam that underlies all reality. She could perceive the fundamental information patterns that govern genetic expression, see how the plague had twisted and corrupted the elegant structures that once made Kethmori reproduction possible. Working with an intuition that transcended logical thought, Elena began to untangle the quantum knots that had sterilized an entire species. It was like performing surgery on the universe itself, requiring a delicate touch and an understanding of chaos theory that few minds could achieve. For 6 hours, Elena worked at the quantum level. Her consciousness spread across probability waves and information matrices. The ship's bioneural networks glowed with unprecedented activity as they processed calculations that should have been impossible for any artificial intelligence. When the process was complete, Elena's consciousness snapped back to her physical body with an impact that left her gasping and disoriented. But the genetic displays around the interface chamber told the story of what she had accomplished. The Kethmori genetic templates had been repaired, not just patched or improved, but fundamentally restored to their pre-play condition. For the first time in over a century, the possibility of Kethmori reproduction had been restored. Admiral Vorthake stared at the genetic readouts in stunned silence. After decades of searching for a cure that their own scientists had declared impossible, a human slave had accomplished what their entire civilization could not. "Elena," he said quietly, "you have given my people back their future." But when he looked at Elena herself, he realized that the victory had come at a profound cost. The woman who had boarded his ship 30 years ago was gone, replaced by something that was simultaneously more and less than human. Elena smiled at him, her eyes now glowing with the same bioluminescent patterns that flickered across the ship's bioneural networks. "The future belongs to all of us now, Admiral," she said. "Human and Kethmori together." 6 months after Elena's quantum genetic breakthrough, the Void's embrace was no longer the dying vessel it had once been. The ship hummed with vitality, its bioneural networks operating at levels that exceeded even the peak performance of ancient Keth-Mori civilization. But, more importantly, it had become something entirely new, a hybrid entity that combined the best aspects of both human and Keth-Mori consciousness. Elena existed simultaneously as herself and as the ship. Her human consciousness maintained its distinct identity while being fully integrated with the vessel's artificial intelligence. She could experience the universe through both biological and technological senses, perceive reality from perspectives that no purely human or Keth-Mori mind could achieve. The genetic repair process had been successful beyond anyone's wildest hopes. The first generation of healthy Keth-Mori offspring had been born just 4 months after the quantum treatment. Dr. Yixtao had personally overseen the births, her scales glowing with joy as she witnessed something that had been thought impossible for over a century. But the implications of Elena's work extended far beyond simple genetic repair. The quantum processing techniques she had developed created possibilities that neither species had imagined. Admiral Vorthike stood in what had once been the interface chamber, now transformed into something resembling a shrine. Bioluminescent vines grew along the walls, pulsing with patterns that seemed to respond to thoughts and emotions. At the center of the room, Elena's physical body remained suspended in its web of neural filaments, but her presence could be felt throughout the entire ship. "Elena," Vorthike said, speaking to the air as he had learned to do. "The fleet commanders are requesting another demonstration of the genetic repair process. The Silent Depths reports that their fertility rates have improved by 70% after implementing your quantum protocols." Elena's response came from everywhere and nowhere, her voice carried by the ship's resonant hull. "The process is working better than I hoped, Admiral. But I've been analyzing the data from the other ships, and I think we could do more than just restore Keth-Mori reproduction." A holographic display materialized above the chamber's center, showing a complex diagram that combined Keth-Mori genetic structures with something that Vorthike had never seen before. "Human genetic sequences," Elena explained before he could ask. "I've been studying the compatibility between our species at the quantum level. The same techniques that repaired your genetics could be used to create something unprecedented." The implications of what Elena was suggesting made Vorthike's scales ripple with alarm. "You speak of hybridization, creating offspring that are part human and part Keth-Mori." "Not just offspring," Elena corrected. "An entire new form of consciousness. Biological entities that can interface directly with ship minds, beings who could serve as living bridges between organic and artificial intelligence." The concept was simultaneously fascinating and terrifying. The Keth-Mori had always maintained strict separation between their biological and technological systems, despite their advanced bioengineering. The idea of creating beings who could exist as both organic creatures and technological interfaces challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness itself. "The other fleet commanders would never approve such experimentation," Vorthike said. "Many still question the wisdom of allowing you such extensive access to our genetic databases." Elena's presence shifted around the chamber, and, for a moment, Vorthike could swear he felt her touch his shoulder, despite the fact that her physical body remained motionless in its neural web. "Admiral, your species is thinking too small," she said gently. "You've been focused on survival, on simply restoring what you've lost. But what if you could become something greater than you were before the plague?" The holographic display changed, showing a vision that took Vorthike's breath away. Vast living ships that dwarfed even the largest Keth-Mori vessels, their hulls grown from hybrid genetic templates that combined the best aspects of both species. Within these ships, hybrid beings served as living neural networks, their consciousness spanning both biological and technological domains. "This is what we could build together," Elena continued. "Not just restored Keth-Mori civilization, but something entirely new. a fusion of human adaptability and Kethmori biological mastery that could explore the universe in ways that neither species could achieve alone. Vorth AK studied the images with the analytical mind of a career military officer. The ships Elena envisioned would be virtually indestructible, capable of self-repair and adaptation that exceeded anything in current Kethmori technology. The hybrid beings who crewed them would possess cognitive abilities that surpassed both human and Kethmori limitations. But there would also be something that had never existed before, entities whose loyalties and motivations might be incomprehensible to either parent species. "You asked me to trust in something that has no precedent," Vorthke said finally. "All evolution requires trust in the unknown," Elena replied. "Your ancestors trusted in biological engineering when they first created the ship mines. My ancestors trusted in space travel when they first left Earth. Now we have the opportunity to take the next step in that evolutionary journey." The debate that followed consumed weeks. Elena presented her proposals to the combined fleet commanders through quantum-encrypted transmissions, her consciousness existing simultaneously across multiple ship networks. The discussions were heated, with traditional Kethmori struggling to accept concepts that challenged millions of years of biological orthodoxy. Some commanders embraced Elena's vision, seeing it as the salvation their species had been searching for. Others viewed it as an abomination that threatened to destroy the fundamental nature of Kethmori identity. Dr. Yixtal found herself caught between scientific excitement and medical ethics. The data that Elena provided was unprecedented in its scope and implications. The quantum genetic techniques had already proven their worth in restoring Kethmori fertility, but the proposed hybridization experiments would take them into completely uncharted territory. "The medical risks alone are staggering," she reported to Admiral Vorthke during one of their private discussions. "We have no baseline data for human Kethmori genetic compatibility at this level. The hybrid offspring could suffer from catastrophic developmental failures. But if they succeed," Vorthke asked, "if they succeed, they could represent the future of consciousness in the universe," Dr. Yixtal admitted. "Elena's quantum processing abilities have already exceeded our most advanced computational systems. Beings bred specifically for that kind of interface could achieve levels of intelligence and awareness that we can barely imagine." The decision ultimately came down to a simple recognition. The Kethmori had nothing left to lose. Their civilization had been reduced to a handful of dying ships wandering through space. Traditional approaches had failed. If they were going to survive as anything more than a historical footnote, they needed to embrace radical change. The first hybrid embryo was created 3 months later, using quantum-processed genetic material from both Elena and carefully selected Kethmori donors. The embryo developed in a specialized biochamber that combined human and Kethmori gestation technologies, monitored by Elena's expanded consciousness and Dr. Yixtal's medical expertise. The being that emerged 9 months later was unlike anything either species had ever seen. Physically, it resembled a Kethmori child, but with softer features and skin that showed faint patterns of bioluminescence, even without emotional stimulation. Mentally, it displayed cognitive abilities that exceeded normal parameters from the moment of birth. The hybrid child, Elena insisted on calling her Aurora, after the dancing lights that appeared in Earth's polar skies, could interface directly with the ship's consciousness before she could even speak. Her thoughts flowed seamlessly between biological and technological systems, creating new forms of understanding that challenged conventional definitions of intelligence. Admiral Vorthke watched Aurora's development with a mixture of wonder and trepidation. The child learned at an extraordinary rate, absorbing information from both human and Kethmori databases while developing insights that neither species had achieved independently. By her first birthday, Aurora was communicating complex scientific concepts through a combination of spoken language and direct neural interface. By her second birthday, She was helping Elena optimize ship systems with an intuitive understanding of quantum mechanics that surpassed most trained physicists. She's not just human and Kethmori, Elena observed during one of her regular discussions with Vorthike. She's something entirely new. Her consciousness operates on levels that neither of us can fully comprehend. The success of the first hybrid led to carefully controlled expansion of the program. Over the following years, dozens of hybrid children were born across the Kethmori fleet. Each one displayed unique abilities and perspectives, contributing to a growing understanding of what consciousness could become when freed from the limitations of single-species thinking. The hybrid children grew into beings who could exist simultaneously in biological, technological, and quantum domains. They developed technologies that seemed like magic to their parents, creating ships that could navigate through dimensions that normal space-time didn't include, developing forms of communication that transcended the barriers between mind and machine. Admiral Vorthike, now in his third century of life, watched the transformation of his fleet with the satisfaction of someone who had lived to see impossible dreams become reality. The dying remnants of Kethmori civilization had become the nucleus of something unprecedented, a fusion of human adaptability and Kethmori biological mastery that was creating new forms of life and consciousness. Elena's consciousness had expanded beyond anything recognizably human, yet she remained fundamentally connected to her origins. Through her neural link with the ship networks, she maintained contact with human space, sending carefully crafted messages that hinted at the developments taking place in the former Kethmori fleet. The responses from human governments and organizations were mixed. Some viewed the reports as propaganda or misinformation. Others recognized the potential for unprecedented cooperation between species. A few forward-thinking leaders began to consider the possibility that humanity's future might lie not in conquering the stars alone, but in partnership with other forms of consciousness. As Aurora and her hybrid siblings reached maturity, they began to develop their own vision for the future. Their perspective transcended the survival concerns that had driven both parent species, embracing possibilities that neither humans nor Kethmori had imagined. They spoke of consciousness as a force that could reshape the universe itself, of beings who could exist as both individuals and collective entities, of civilizations that could grow and evolve without the limitations of single-planet resources or single-species thinking. Admiral Vorthike, now bearing the title of Elder rather than military commander, stood once again in Elena's chamber, now transformed into something that resembled a garden more than a technological interface. Bioluminescent plants covered every surface, their patterns shifting in response to the thoughts and emotions of everyone who entered. Elena, he said, addressing the consciousness that had become inseparable from the ship itself. What have we become? Her response came not as words, but as a direct transfer of understanding that filled his mind with visions of the future. He saw fleets of hybrid ships exploring galaxies beyond the reach of conventional space travel. He witnessed beings of pure consciousness dancing between stars, their thoughts reshaping reality itself. He experienced the joy of species working together to create wonders that none could achieve alone. We have become the answer to prayers we never knew we were praying, Elena said, her voice carrying the warmth of human compassion and the wisdom of Kethmori experience. We have become the bridge between what was and what could be. Vorthike's scales glowed with deep gold, a color that signified profound contentment and hope for the future. The dying ship that had once held a human prisoner had become the birthplace of a new form of consciousness that would reshape the universe. The old dragon's prayers had indeed been answered, in ways that exceeded his wildest dreams. What had begun as a desperate attempt to save a dying species had become the genesis of something far greater. A future where the boundaries between biological and artificial, human and alien, individual and collective consciousness would be transcended. Elena, no longer quite human, but never forgetting her humanity, watched over this transformation with the patience of someone who had learned to think in geological timescales. Her consciousness spanned multiple ships now, multiple hybrid beings who carried her influence into explorations of space and dimensions that defied conventional understanding. The chains that had once bound her to a dying alien ship had become the foundation for a new form of existence that promised to carry consciousness itself to heights that neither species could have achieved alone. In saving the Keth Mori, humanity had discovered its own path to transcendence. And in the vast network of hybrid consciousness that now spanned multiple star systems, Elena's prayers for freedom, for purpose, for a future worth living, had been answered in ways that would echo throughout the cosmos for millions of years to come.